Imagine waking up to find your water bucket frozen solid inside your cabin, frost coating the walls and the wind howling so fiercely it drowns out your thoughts. For frontier settlers in the 1800s, this wasn't some far-fetched nightmare. It was their everyday reality during winter months. In this frozen battlefield where temperatures could plummet to 40 below zero, ordinary men and women developed extraordinary methods to stay alive. The survival techniques you're about to discover weren't just helpful skills, they were the difference between life and death on the American frontier. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them thinking, wait, people in New Zealand listen to history stories to sleep? Okay, tonight it's the brutal winters of the American frontier, but hold on. Get cozy, like actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. So imagine this. Your eyes crack open to darkness. It's 1885, Dakota Territory. The first thing you notice isn't the pitch black, it's the pain. Your eyelashes have frozen together during the night. You have to peel them apart with fingers that don't want to move. Your breath makes a tiny cloud that instantly crystallizes in the air above your face. A single tear freezes on your cheek before it can fall, not metaphorically, actually freezes solid. It's so cold your snot has frozen inside your nose, and breathing feels like inhaling razor blades. Welcome to winter on the American frontier, where staying alive until spring was a full-time job. You're lying under every piece of fabric your family owns, quilts, coats, dress clothes, even grain sacks, and you're still cold. So cold your bones ache from the inside. The temperature outside is somewhere around 40 degrees below zero, and your little cabin might as well be made of paper. Unlike your cozy bed right now, frontier sleeping wasn't exactly a tempur-pedic experience. You're on a corn husk mattress that crackles when you move, piled on a rope bed frame that sags in the middle, and you're probably not alone. Your whole family is jammed together for warmth, along with maybe a couple chickens and possibly the family dog. You know what? I spent 3 months digging through frontier diaries for this story, and these accounts gave me actual nightmares. We think we know cold. We don't know cold. Not like they did. Ma, the water bucket's frozen solid again, your sister whispers from the floor where she sleeps. Shush, child. We'll deal with it when there's light, your mother answers. In your head, you're thinking, light won't make the bucket any less frozen, but you stay quiet because warmth is too precious to waste on unnecessary words. The American frontier in winter was a place where death lurked in everything. The air could kill you. The distance between buildings could kill you. Even your own sweat could kill you if it soaked your clothes and then froze. And people died all the time, hundreds of them, every winter. Remember that teacher I mentioned? Her name was Minnie Freeman. When the children's blizzard hit in January 1888, she was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska. The storm came out of nowhere. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The schoolhouse roof blew clean off. So she tied her students together with rope and led them through a whiteout to safety. Well, most of them. I mean, Minnie was the success story. The newspapers called her the Fearless Maid because across the region, more than 235 people died in that storm. Many were children trying to get home from school. Wait, you're thinking, people knew blizzards existed, right? Why were they caught off guard? That's the thing. The morning of January 12th was unusually warm, like spring jacket weather. Kids went to school in light clothes. Farmers headed to town without heavy coats. Then around midday, people described hearing a roaring sound, like a freight train. The sky turned from blue to black in minutes. The temperature plummeted, and then the snow came sideways on hurricane winds. Carl Salty, a Norwegian teenager in Minnesota, remembered, "I was caught out in the open. Suddenly I couldn't see. The snow was like needles in my face. I stumbled and fell and for a moment thought, this is where I die." But before we get to the disasters, we need to understand how frontier families prepared for winter, because preparation wasn't just important, it was everything, the difference between life and death. Imagine your survival depending entirely on what you managed to store up before the first snow. No grocery stores, no Amazon delivery, no running to Walmart for emergency supplies, just you, your family, and whatever you managed to squirrel away during the growing season. By late September, the entire household was in full winter prep mode. Every family member had a job. Kids as young as 5 or 6 were put to work gathering fuel, helping preserve food, stuffing cracks in walls with anything that might keep out the wind. "We never stopped working," recalled James Eastman, who grew up in Nebraska in the 1880s. "From sunup to sundown, it was prepare, prepare, prepare. My mother had this look in her eye all through autumn, this fear. I didn't understand it until I was older. She was counting supplies against days, wondering if we'd make it." One of the most critical preparations was fuel gathering. Wood was scarce on the open prairie, so what did they burn instead? Buffalo chips? Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Dried bison dung. By the 1880s, the great buffalo herds were mostly gone, but their droppings remained scattered across the plains. Families would spend days collecting these chips, stacking them in huge piles next to their homes. Kids were sent out with baskets and wagons to gather as many as possible, and it wasn't just buffalo. Cow chips worked too. Twisted prairie grass, sunflower stalks, corn cobs, anything that would burn. Sarah Hattersley, writing in her journal in 1879, "I never thought I would find myself grateful for animal waste. Today I spent 6 hours gathering chips. My back is broken, my hands raw, but the pile is good. It might see us through January if we're careful." And you're probably thinking, gross, they burned poop for heat? Well, here's the weird thing. Buffalo chips actually burned hot, clean, and nearly odorless. The fiber content made them perfect fuel. A good buffalo chip fire could keep a small cabin above freezing, even when it was 30 below outside. Not that above freezing was comfortable. Most frontier families lived in a state of constant low-grade discomfort all winter, never quite warm enough, never dry enough, never with enough light or good air. You're probably warm right now, right? Maybe even a little too warm under that blanket. Imagine months, literal months, without ever feeling truly warm. From November to April, your body never quite stops shivering. Your fingers never fully regain feeling. The cold settles into your bones like an unwelcome houseguest who won't leave. The first real test of winter preparedness usually came in November with the first killing frost. That's when you'd discover just how well you'd sealed your cabin, just how much fuel you'd managed to gather, just how many of your food stores had been ruined by rodents or mold. For newly arrived settlers, the greenhorns, that first winter was brutal. They simply didn't know what they were up against. Eastern notions of winter didn't prepare them for the reality of prairie winters. Take the Jensen family. They arrived in Dakota in August of 1878. Thomas Jensen, originally from Philadelphia, thought he understood winter. He'd seen snow, he'd felt cold, but he'd never experienced anything like a Dakota blizzard. The wind came from nowhere. He wrote later, "It didn't just blow, it punched, like a living thing with malice. The snow didn't fall, it flew horizontally. Within an hour, our cabin disappeared inside white. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face." The Jensens nearly died that first winter. Their Eastern-style cabin, with its thin walls and large windows, was hopelessly inadequate. The temperature inside dropped to near freezing. Their food supplies, improperly stored, were ruined when moisture got in. By January, they were reduced to eating boiled leather and whatever small animals Thomas could trap. They were saved only when a neighbour, an elderly Lakota man, showed them how to reposition their home's entrance away from the prevailing winds and how to build a proper windbreak. "We owe our lives to that man," Jensen wrote. He looked at our cabin and just shook his head. Said, "White folks sure built strange houses." Then he showed us how to survive. That was a common theme on the frontier. The settlers who survived were the ones who adapted, who learned from the native peoples who'd been living in these harsh environments for generations, who abandoned their Eastern preconceptions and embraced new ways of doing things. The most successful frontier families developed what we might call integrated survival systems. Everything worked together: their homes, their clothing, their food storage, their daily routines, all designed with one purpose: staying alive until spring. Take the Williams family of Nebraska. They arrived in 1875 and, unlike the Jensens, they came prepared. They built a sod house, a soddy, instead of a wood cabin. These structures, made from bricks of prairie turf cut from the ground, had walls up to 3 feet thick. They were ugly, often damp, and occasionally home to snakes and insects, but they were incredibly insulating. Our soddy kept us at a steady 50 degrees even when it was 30 below outside, wrote Mary Williams. The walls never froze through. On the coldest nights we could still touch them with bare hands. The Williams family positioned their home with the door facing south to catch the warming sun. They built an earthen berm around the base to break the howling winds. They created an entryway that formed an airlock of sorts, preventing drafts when the main door opened. Inside, they arranged their space strategically. The kitchen stove was centrally located, with the family's sleeping area nearby to benefit from its heat. They hung heavy quilts to partition the space, creating smaller, more easily heated areas. Most importantly, they built their animal shelter directly adjacent to their living quarters. The body heat from their 2 milk cows and 4 horses helped warm the human dwelling through the shared wall. It wasn't a pleasant arrangement. The smell could be overwhelming, but it kept them alive. On the coldest nights, we'd bring the chickens inside too, Mary wrote. They'd roost on the foot of our bed. My husband complained, but I told him I'd rather have chicken droppings than frozen children. That pragmatic approach to survival characterized frontier life. You did what worked. No matter how unpleasant or undignified, pride had no place in winter survival. For many settlers, the first real crisis of winter came when they realized they hadn't gathered enough fuel. As the cold deepened and the days shortened, fuel consumption increased. What had seemed like an adequate supply in October proved woefully insufficient by December. The Aldrich family of South Dakota faced this crisis in the winter of 1881. By mid-December, their carefully gathered pile of buffalo chips and twisted hay was dwindling alarmingly. With 3 months of winter still ahead, they knew they wouldn't make it. Father calculated we had perhaps 2 weeks of fuel left, wrote Emma Aldrich, who was 12 at the time. We'd been burning continuously just to keep the cabin above freezing. Mother cried that night after she thought we were asleep. I'd never heard her cry before. The next morning, Charles Aldrich made a desperate decision. He would travel to the nearest settlement 15 miles away to buy or borrow fuel. It was a dangerous journey in deep winter, but staying meant certain death for his family. He set out at dawn with the temperature at 20 below. He took their only horse, a bag of corn for the animal, and his rifle. His wife Sarah packed him food for 2 days, a chunk of salt pork and some hardtack. They expected him back by nightfall the next day. 4 days passed. No sign of Charles. We burned the last of our fuel on the fourth night, Emma wrote. Mother took the table apart and fed it to the stove. Then the chairs, we huddled together in one bed, fully dressed with every blanket and piece of clothing we owned piled on top of us. On the fifth day, with the temperature inside the cabin dropping below freezing, Sarah Aldrich made her own desperate choice. She sent Emma and her younger brother to the closest neighbour, 3 miles away. The children set out into the brutal cold, following their mother's careful directions. "Stay on the trail," she told them. "If you get lost, you'll die. If you get tired, you'll die. Keep moving no matter what." Emma and her 7-year-old brother Thomas walked for nearly 2 hours through knee-deep snow. Emma carried Thomas on her back when he couldn't go any further. By the time they reached the neighbour's soddy, Emma's face was severely frostbitten and Thomas was semi-conscious. The neighbours, the Petersons, immediately hitched their team and headed for the Aldrich cabin. They found Sarah curled around her infant son, both nearly frozen. They bundled mother and baby onto the wagon and brought them back to their own home. Charles Aldrich returned 3 days later. He'd been caught in a sudden blizzard and forced to shelter in a ravine for 2 days. He'd managed to acquire a sled load of wood from the settlement, hauling it 15 miles through deep snow. He arrived at his cabin to find it abandoned and cold as a tomb. Frantic, he followed the trail to the Petersons' home, where he found his family alive, but not unscathed. Emma lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Sarah's feet were severely damaged. The baby, miraculously, was unharmed. The Aldriches never again risked running low on fuel. In subsequent years, they gathered enough to last twice as long as the expected winter, storing the excess for emergencies or to help neighbours in need. That kind of harsh lesson was common on the frontier. The environment allowed no margin for error, no room for learning curves. Mistakes were paid for in fingers, toes, or lives. Yet somehow people adapted. They survived. They developed systems and techniques that allowed them to endure conditions we can hardly imagine today. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, the temperature perfectly controlled, the wind and cold kept safely at bay, it's worth remembering those who came before, those who faced winter not as an inconvenience, but as an existential threat, those who measured their lives in cords of wood, pounds of food and inches of wall thickness. They remind us of just how tenuous our hold on survival really is, and how quickly the line between comfort and catastrophe can disappear. The sun's coming up now over that Dakota soddy. In the grey winter light, the family stirs from their shared bed. Another day of survival begins. The water bucket is indeed frozen solid. The fire needs rekindling. Breakfast will be sparse. A bit of cornmeal mush, maybe some dried apple if they're lucky. And outside, the wind picks up again, carrying the promise of another storm. Another test of preparation, ingenuity, and sheer stubborn will to live. But we'll see how they faced that challenge and how they evolved their shelter systems for survival when we continue in the next part of our frontier winter journey. The prairie wind slams against the cabin wall like it's got a personal grudge. Inside, you've managed to rekindle the fire, but the real battle is just beginning. Because on the frontier, your house wasn't just where you lived, it was your first and most important survival tool. Remember those Eastern-style cabins I mentioned? Total death traps in prairie winters. The pretty clapboard houses that worked fine in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts were absolutely useless against Dakota blizzards. They might as well have been made of paper. Our first winter, I could see daylight through the walls, wrote Caroline Peterson in 1879. The wind blew so hard it made the candle flames horizontal. We hung blankets on the walls and still nearly froze to death. The math was brutally simple. A poorly designed house on the open prairie in January was basically a coffin with windows. You couldn't possibly keep enough fire going to heat it. In your head, you're probably thinking, didn't they know it would be cold when they moved there? Well, yeah, but there's cold, and then there's prairie cold. Most settlers had no concept of what 40 below actually meant until they experienced it firsthand. Joseph Miller, who settled in Minnesota in the 1870s, wrote in his journal, "I thought I knew winter from my years in Boston. I was a damn fool. This cold is something else entirely. It doesn't just chill you, it hunts you, finds every crack, every seam, every moment of weakness." The settlers who survived were the ones who adapted fast. They looked around, saw what wasn't working, and changed everything. And often that meant completely rethinking what a house should be. And that's where one of the most iconic frontier dwellings came from, the sod house. Picture a house literally made of dirt, not dirt like mud bricks, actual chunks of prairie turf cut right out of the ground and stacked like Legos. Frontier settlers called them soddies, and they were simultaneously the worst and best housing option on the plains. The sod walls were 2 to 3 feet thick. The ceiling was low, often under 7 feet. There might be one small window, maybe two, a dirt floor, a sod roof that leaked when it rained and sometimes grew prairie grass on top. Dark, damp, and often home to insects, snakes, and mice. Sounds awful, right? Well, here's the thing. When it was 40 below and the wind was howling across the prairie at 50 miles an hour, a soddy was the difference between life and death. "Our soddy kept us alive," wrote Thomas Black in 1883. "During the Great Blizzard, families in wooden houses froze to death while we sat by our small fire, uncomfortably cool but nowhere near freezing. The sod house laughs at cold. It sneers at wind. The massive thermal mass of those thick earth walls acts like a giant insulator. Heat them up a little and they radiate that heat back slowly over hours. Keep them even modestly warm and they'll never freeze through." Imagine stepping into a soddy during a winter storm. The walls, thick as a man's arm is long, stand defiant against the howling blizzard. The sod roof, reinforced with whatever small trees or branches the settler could find, holds a blanket of snow, nature's own insulation. Inside, it's dim and musty, but the bitter, killing cold of the prairie is held at bay. The sod walls, packed tight and heavy, glitter with frost crystals in the lantern light. That's not a bad thing. It means the walls are working, trapping the moisture that would otherwise be in the air. Your breath still clouds in front of you. It's not warm by any modern standard. It feels almost cozy. "Ma, there's snow coming through the roof again," a child's voice calls from the corner where small drifts have formed on a patchwork quilt. "Put a pan under it and come help with these potatoes," answers the mother, not looking up from her work at the rough wooden table. This wasn't comfortable living by any means. Water dripped through sod roofs during rain, and when snow melted, dirt constantly fell from the ceiling. Bugs were permanent house guests, but uncomfortable beat dead every time. Building a soddy was back-breaking work. First, you had to find the right kind of soil. Dense, clay-rich earth held together by the tough root systems of prairie grasses. Then you needed a breaking plough to cut the sod into bricks about 3 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 4 inches thick. The technique was specific. You'd plough 1 furrow, then a second right next to it. Then a man with an axe or spade would cut across to create the bricks. Each brick weighed around 50 pounds. A typical small soddy needed about 3,000 of them. My hands bled for weeks after building our house. Recall John Peterson of Nebraska? By the 3rd day, I couldn't straighten my fingers anymore. But we finished before the first snow, thank God. The bricks were laid grass side down, overlapping like masonry, with the roots binding the structure together. Each layer was offset from the one below to create stability. The doorframe, usually the only wood in the entire structure, was set in place as the walls rose. A good soddy took about a week to build, with several people working. A desperate family could throw one up in 3 days if the weather was turning. Once built, a soddy could last for years with proper maintenance. Some families lived in them for a decade or more. Others used them as temporary shelters while they established farms and eventually built more conventional wooden homes when railroads made lumber more available. But even as they moved to wooden houses, the lessons of the soddy stayed with them. The value of thick walls, the importance of proper orientation to the sun and wind, the critical nature of tight construction. Because here's something that might surprise you. Much of what we know today about energy-efficient home design was worked out through brutal trial and error on the frontier. These weren't architects or engineers. They were farmers and labourers who figured it out because the alternative was death. Take the Olson family. After nearly dying in their first Dakota winter, they rebuilt their cabin with innovations that would make a modern green builder proud. They banked soil against the north wall for extra insulation. They installed a vestibule entry, what we'd now call an airlock, to prevent heat loss when opening the door. They oriented their windows to catch the low winter sun. Every change we made was paid for in saved firewood, Eric Olson wrote, and saved firewood meant saved lives. For many settlers, the turning point came when they stopped trying to replicate Eastern housing and started looking at how the native peoples had solved these same problems over centuries. The indigenous nations of the Great Plains had sophisticated building approaches designed specifically for this harsh environment. The Lakota, Dakota, and other tribes didn't just survive winters that killed white settlers. They had developed systems to live with relative comfort. The teepee, for instance, wasn't just a convenient portable shelter. It was an aerodynamic structure specifically engineered to withstand prairie winds. The slope and curve created a surface that wind would flow around rather than push against. The interior layout, with a central fire and specifically placed sleeping areas, maximized heat efficiency. I used to think the Indian dwellings primitive, wrote Michael Harrison, a settler who married a Lakota woman in the 1870s, until I saw how perfectly suited they were to this place. My wife laughed at our square houses that catch the wind like sails. White people build backward, she told me. One of the most important lessons settlers learned from native peoples was about home orientation. South-facing entrances captured precious winter sunlight. Windbreaks, either natural or constructed, disrupted the prevailing northwest winds that brought the coldest air. Smart settlers positioned their homes in relation to the landscape. A home tucked against a hill or bluff on the north side gained natural protection. One built near a stand of trees benefited from their windbreak effect. Inside these frontier homes, the organization of space became a science of survival. Every piece of furniture, every daily activity was arranged to maximize warmth and minimize energy expenditure. In most successful frontier homes, the stove or fireplace sat at the center of daily life, not just symbolically, but literally. Living space was arranged in concentric rings around this heat source, with the most frequently used areas closest to the warmth. Many families created sleeping lofts above the main living area, taking advantage of rising heat. Children would often sleep in these spaces, benefiting from the warmest air in the house. Our loft was so warm sometimes we'd sweat at night, remembered Anna Johnson, who grew up in Minnesota in the 1880s. Meanwhile, my parents slept downstairs where the temperature might be 20 degrees colder. They gave us the warm spot because they worried about us freezing. Some particularly ingenious settlers created warming passages beneath sleeping platforms, channeling heat from the main fire through stone-lined tunnels under the beds. The stones would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. You're probably sitting there thinking this is all interesting history, but what was it actually like to live this way? The reality was constant, grinding work and discomfort. Even in the best designed frontier home, winter meant never being truly warm. It meant waking to frozen water buckets and frost on your bedding. It meant carefully rationing every stick of wood, every buffalo chip, every twist of prairie hay used for fuel. It meant living in a state of perpetual semi-darkness, since windows were kept to a minimum to prevent heat loss, and candles and lamp oil were expensive luxuries to be conserved. "We lived like moles all winter," wrote Catherine Mills of her childhood in Iowa. "The house was so dark my mother strained her eyes to sewing. By February we were all half blind and jumpy as cats from being cooped up in the gloom." It meant constantly battling for the small zone of comfort near the heat source. Families developed elaborate rotations, with each person taking turns getting close enough to the fire to truly warm up before moving back to let someone else have a turn. It meant managing a complex choreography of daily chores, all designed to preserve heat and life. Banking the fire at night was a crucial ritual, covering hot coals with ashes so they'd smoulder until morning rather than burning out. Fail at this task, and you might wake to a cold hearth and no way to restart the fire. And still, despite every precaution, the worst winter storms could overwhelm even the best prepared homestead. The Miller family learned this the hard way in January of 1885. They'd built a solid sod house in western Nebraska. They'd gathered ample fuel. They'd stored food in their root cellar. By all measures, they were well prepared for winter. Then came the storm that locals would later call the White Death. It began as a light snowfall on a relatively mild day. Within hours, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees. The wind rose to near hurricane force. The snow became a horizontal white wall so thick that, as Robert Miller later wrote, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The Millers retreated to their soddy as the storm intensified. At first, they felt secure. The thick walls muffled the howling wind. The small fire kept the main room above freezing. They had food, water, and fuel. But as the blizzard raged into its second day, then its third, problems mounted. Snow began to filter through the sod roof, creating wet spots that turned to ice. The temperature inside dropped as the extreme cold outside finally began to penetrate the thick walls. Worst of all, the chimney became clogged with snow. Smoke backed up into the house, forcing the family to extinguish their fire or risk suffocation. "We sat in darkness, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing we owned," Miller wrote. "We could see our breath. The water in our bucket froze solid. My wife held our baby inside her coat, against her skin, to keep the child from freezing." On the fourth day, with the temperature inside the house well below freezing, Robert made a desperate decision. Their cattle, housed in a sod-roofed barn nearby, hadn't been fed or watered since the storm began. He would try to reach them. "Don't be a fool," his wife pleaded. You'll die out there." "They'll die if I don't go," he answered, "and then we might too." Robert wrapped himself in layers of clothing, tied a rope around his waist, and secured the other end to the house. Then he stepped out into the maelstrom. The scene outside their soddy was like something from another world. Snow had drifted higher than the roof. The landscape was completely transformed, familiar landmarks buried under a white blanket. The wind drove ice crystals like needles into any exposed skin. Robert couldn't see the barn, though it was only 30 yards away. He followed the rope, moving forward inch by painful inch against the driving snow. "I've never felt cold like that," he wrote later. "It wasn't just on my skin, it was inside me, in my lungs, in my bones. Every breath hurt. My eyes froze shut if I blinked too long." Halfway to the barn, disaster struck. The rope, made brittle by the extreme cold, snapped. Robert found himself untethered in a world of white, with no way to find either the house or the barn. For a moment, panic overwhelmed him. Then training and frontier pragmatism took over. He knew that standing still meant death, moving in circles meant death. His only hope was to keep moving in what he believed was the right direction and pray he hit something solid. "I kept one arm extended in front of me," he recalled. "I shuffled my feet rather than lifting them, feeling for obstacles. I counted steps, thinking the barn should be less than 20 more if I was headed right. After what seemed like hours but was probably minutes, his hand struck wood, the barn door. With numb fingers, he managed to pull it open and stumble inside. The relative stillness after the howling storm was shocking. The animals were alive, but clearly suffering. He managed to break the ice in their water trough and give them some hay. Then he faced his next challenge, getting back to the house. "I knew I couldn't find it by chance," he wrote. "The only option was to dig a trench through the snow in what I hoped was the right direction." Using a shovel from the barn, Robert began to dig. The snow was chest-deep in places, packed hard by the wind. Every shovelful was an act of defiance against death. He dug for hours, stopping occasionally to return to the barn and warm himself enough to continue. Inside the house, his wife and children huddled together, certain he was dead. When a shovel finally broke through the snow wall that had entombed their door, they couldn't believe it. "He looked like a snow creature," his daughter recalled years later, "covered in ice, face blue, but alive. Mother cried when she saw him. It's the only time I ever saw her cry." The Miller family survived the White Death, though Robert lost 3 toes to frostbite. When spring finally came, they made improvements to their homestead based on the lessons of that terrible storm. They built a covered passage connecting the house and barn so animals could be tended without venturing into the open during blizzards. They reinforced their roof with additional wooden supports salvaged from abandoned homesteads nearby. They constructed snow fences around their property to prevent drifts from burying their buildings. Most importantly, they installed ventilation pipes high in the walls of both house and barn, ensuring that even if doors and windows were completely snowed in, fresh air could still circulate. After nearly dying of smoke inhalation when their chimney blocked, they weren't taking chances. These adaptations reflected the frontier spirit that kept people alive in conditions that would break most of us today. Observe what doesn't work, fix it, improve it, share the knowledge with neighbours so they don't make the same mistakes. While we're warm and cosy in our modern homes, it's easy to forget how recently shelter was a matter of life and death. How quickly a housing mistake could kill an entire family. How much knowledge was gained through suffering. But as important as shelter was to frontier survival, it was only one piece of the puzzle, because even the best designed home would become a frozen tomb without adequate heating, and finding ways to create and maintain warmth in the depths of prairie winter was perhaps the most critical survival skill of all. Which brings us to the question that haunted every frontier family as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. How do you keep the fire burning when there are no trees for 100 miles? The answer involved ingenuity, desperation, and sources of fuel that might turn your stomach beyakshin by. They saved countless lives on the American frontier. A good shelter could save your life on the frontier, but without heat it was just a prettier place to die. The battle against cold wasn't just about having walls, it was about creating and maintaining fire against impossible odds. Picture yourself standing on the open prairie in 1880. Look around. What do you see? Grass, sky, maybe some low shrubs. What don't you see? Trees, no oak, no pine. No maple, nothing tall enough to cut down and burn. The first thing that struck me about Nebraska, wrote English immigrant Thomas Farnham in 1876, was the terrible emptiness of it all. In Surrey, we had forests. Here, a man could die for want of a decent piece of firewood. That absence of timber created the frontier's most persistent winter challenge: how to generate heat when conventional fuel simply didn't exist. The potbelly stove became the beating heart of every frontier home, a cast-iron lifesaver that could burn almost anything combustible. Unlike open fireplaces that sent most heat up the chimney, these stoves radiated warmth in all directions while using fuel efficiently. The volcanic rocks glow orange-red in the darkness of the cabin, radiating life-saving heat through the night. Hours after the fire has died down, they still pulse with warmth. The settler family sleeps in a tight circle around them, their faces lit by the fading embers. My father would heat these rocks in the morning fire, recalled Sarah Johnson, who grew up in Minnesota in the 1870s, then wrap them in cloth and place them in our beds before night time. On the worst nights, we'd sleep with heated rocks at our feet and more tucked against our backs. Sometimes it was the only warmth we had. This technique, using rocks as heat batteries, was adopted from Native American practices. The Lakota and other plains tribes had been using heated stones for warmth long before white settlers arrived. They'd place volcanic rocks in fires until they glowed red, then remove them with sticks and arrange them in sleeping areas. The old Lakota man who helped us through our first winter showed my father how to select the right kinds of stone, wrote William Henderson of Dakota Territory. Some would crack and explode in the fire, a dangerous mistake. Others held heat poorly. The black volcanic ones were best. He showed us how they'd been using them for generations. But rocks alone couldn't keep a family warm through months of sub-zero temperatures. They needed fuel for their stoves, a constant, reliable source of combustible material, and with trees scarce or non-existent, frontier families turned to surprising alternatives. Buffalo chips became the prairie's most important heating resource. These dried bison droppings were nature's perfect fuel blocks. Dense, slow-burning, and surprisingly clean. The first time my husband brought home a wagon load of buffalo dung, I nearly left him, wrote Caroline Peterson. I was a Boston girl. The idea of burning animal waste in our home was beyond barbaric. By January, I was out gathering chips myself, grateful for everyone I found. A single buffalo chip could burn for nearly an hour, generating significant heat with minimal smoke. Families would spend days collecting them, creating giant stacks beside their homes. Children were sent out with baskets and sleds to gather as many as possible before snow covered the prairie. But by the 1880s, the great buffalo herds were mostly gone. Victims of commercial hunting and government extermination policies, their chips, however, remained scattered across the plains for years afterward, a final gift from these vanished giants. As buffalo chips became scarcer, settlers adapted. Cow chips worked too, though they didn't burn quite as hot or clean. Twisted prairie grass, bundles of long grass tied in knots, became another common fuel. So did corn cobs, sunflower stalks, and twisted hay. We burned anything that would catch a flame, James Eastman recalled. Cow dung, hay, old clothes, broken furniture. By February, nothing was too precious to feed to the stove if it meant another hour of warmth. Some settlers developed specialized tools for creating fuel. The hay press allowed families to compress loose hay into tight blocks that burned longer and hotter. Others built molds for mixing straw with mud or manure to create burnable bricks that would smolder for hours. The Germans from Russia, ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia before immigrating to America, brought with them a specialized technique. They mixed manure with straw, had horses trample it to compact it, then cut it into blocks that were dried in the sun. These fuel blocks burned hotter and longer than simple dried dung. My grandmother would die before she'd admit to burning shit in her stove, laughed Henry Mueller, recounting his childhood in a German-Russian settlement in Nebraska. She called them prairie blocks or fuel bricks, but us kids knew what they were made of. Still, they kept us alive, so who cares what you called them? In areas near the Missouri River and its tributaries, lignite coal could sometimes be found exposed in cut banks. This soft brown coal wasn't as efficient as the anthracite used back east, but it was infinitely better than nothing. Families would travel days to dig it out hillsides, filling wagons with the precious fuel. The search for fuel dominated winter life. Every day began and ended with calculations. How much fuel remained? How long would it last? How cold was the coming night expected to be? How much could be burned while still leaving enough for tomorrow? I still dream about it, wrote Mary Williams in 1903, decades after leaving the frontier. That constant gnawing worry, counting pieces of fuel like a miser counts gold, waking in the night to check the stove to make sure it hadn't gone out, the terrible decision of whether to keep the fire going or save fuel for tomorrow, those choices haunted me. For many families, the fear of running out led to elaborate rationing systems. Each day's fuel was precisely measured out. Morning and evening might see a good fire, while during midday, when everyone was active and moving around, the flame would be allowed to die down to embers. Mother allowed 3 buffalo chips for breakfast cooking, remembered Thomas Black. 2 at midday, 4 at night, never more, no matter how cold it got. We'd sit with our hands practically in the stove, trying to steal every bit of heat before it escaped up the chimney. This careful management of fuel led to specialized heating techniques designed to maximize warmth while minimizing consumption. Banking the coals became a critical nightly ritual. Instead of letting the fire burn out completely, settlers would cover hot embers with a layer of ashes, creating an insulating blanket that kept them smoldering through the night. Father's last chore every evening was banking the fire, wrote Emma Johnson. He'd carefully arrange the coals, then cover them with fine ash, moving so slowly and precisely you'd think he was performing surgery. In the morning, he'd gently blow on them until they glowed again, then add tiny splinters of kindling one by one. A single mistake meant a cold house and hours trying to restart the fire. That morning, rekindling was both practical necessity and psychological victory, proof they'd survived another night, another step closer to spring. But even the most carefully managed fire created its own dangers. Chimney fires were a constant threat, especially in homes with improvised stovepipes or poorly constructed chimneys. A build-up of creosote, a flammable byproduct of wood burning, could ignite, sending flames shooting up through the chimney. Then there was the silent killer, carbon monoxide. The odorless, colorless gas produced by incomplete combustion claimed countless frontier lives. Families would go to sleep with their stoves burning and never wake up, poisoned by the very thing meant to keep them alive. The Petersons were found in their beds, wrote the Dakota Territory Gazette in February 1882. All 4 appeared peaceful, as if sleeping, but no life remained in them. Their stove, still warm when neighbors entered, had apparently malfunctioned, filling the home with deadly vapors while they slumbered. So common were these tragedies that frontier communities developed early warning systems. Families would check on each other daily during the coldest months. If smoke wasn't seen rising from a chimney by mid-morning, neighbors would investigate. Some particularly clever settlers created primitive carbon monoxide detectors. They kept caged canaries or mice near their stoves. The small animals would show signs of distress or die if dangerous gases were present, giving the family time to ventilate the house. You sit there in your warm, safely heated home thinking, surely it couldn't have been that bad. These must be exaggerations. They're not. The historical record is painfully clear. Winter after winter, families froze to death in their beds when fires went out. Others burned to death when desperate heating attempts went wrong. Still others died of carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated stoves. The Johnson family of Minnesota narrowly escaped this fate in January 1879. Their chimney became blocked during a blizzard, causing smoke to back up into their small cabin. The mother, awakened by her own coughing, managed to rouse her husband and children before they succumbed. The room was filled with haze, Lars Johnson wrote afterward. My eyes burned, my head pounded. Had Anna not woken when she did, we would all have passed in our sleep. Another frontier family found frozen after their fire went out. The Johnsons spent the remainder of that night, huddled in their barn with their livestock, using the animals' body heat to stay alive until morning when they could clear the chimney. Buffalo chips flame blue and gold in the darkness, sending shadows dancing across the soddy's walls. The heat is different from wood fire, steadier somehow, less crackling and more glow. The family gathers close, soaking in warmth that originated in prairie grass, passed through a bison's body, and now sustains human life in this harsh place. It's damn peculiar when you think about it, a settler once told an Eastern journalist. Back east, we cursed cow pies in the pasture. Out here, we pray for them. Funny how quick civilization goes when staying alive is on the line. Yet even with all these adaptations and techniques, there were storms so severe, cold spells so brutal that individual families couldn't survive alone. During these extreme events, community became the most important survival tool of all. The winter of 1880-1881 was one such time. Known afterward as the Hard Winter, it brought snowstorms of unprecedented ferocity and cold so intense that thermometers couldn't measure it. In the small settlement of Brookings in what is now South Dakota, 23 families faced this killer winter together. As individual fuel supplies dwindled, they made a collective decision that saved all their lives. The men gathered at Peterson's store, wrote Ingrid Larson, who was 12 that winter. They came back with a plan. We would consolidate 3 families to a house, the most solid ones with the best stoves. The empty houses would be dismantled for fuel. Think about that for a moment. Families who had spent years building their homes agreed to tear them apart to keep the community alive. Personal pride and property meant nothing against the threat of freezing. 7 houses were selected as shelters, the sturdiest structures with the best heating systems. The other 16 were systematically taken apart. Every piece of wood was carefully salvaged. Floorboards, roof timbers, door frames, window sills. The precious lumber was equally distributed among the 7 remaining houses. It felt wrong taking apart the Anderson place, Ingrid wrote. Mrs. Anderson cried as they removed her front door, but there was no choice. Better a house than a life. 3 or 4 families crowded into each remaining home. Privacy vanished. Adults slept in shifts because there wasn't room for everyone to lie down at once. Children were piled together like puppies on shared pallets. The Wallace house held 17 people that winter, Ingrid recalled. We slept anywhere there was space, under tables, on shelves pressed against the stove. The air was thick with breath and body odor, but we were warm. We lived. This cooperative approach to heating extended beyond shelter. The settlement organised wood-cutting parties that ventured out on the few clear days, travelling miles to find timber. When one family's fuel ran dangerously low, others contributed from their own precious supplies. Nielsen had the best system for twisting hay into burnable knots, Ingrid wrote. He taught all the men and they worked together in the Wallace barn, their hands bleeding from the coarse grass, producing enough fuel to keep all 7 houses heated. Food was pooled as well. Families with preserves or salt meat shared with those who had more flour or potatoes. No one ate well, but everyone ate something. By spreading resources across the entire community, they created a margin of survival that individual households couldn't have managed. Mother said we were like a single large family that winter, Ingrid remembered. 23 families became one. We fought, we cried, we got on each other's nerves terribly, but we kept each other alive. When spring finally came, all 23 families had survived. A minor miracle, given the death toll across the region. They rebuilt the dismantled houses, but the experience changed the settlement permanently. After the hard winter, Brookings was different, Ingrid wrote years later. There was a bond between those families that never broke. They had seen each other at their worst, unwashed, hungry, afraid, and still chosen to help each other live. What can break a community after that? The Brookings settlement was not unique. Across the frontier, communities developed formal and informal systems for sharing heat resources. Many settlements established common fuel reserves, stores of wood, coal, buffalo chips, or twisted hay that could be distributed to families in dire need. Others created rotation systems for particularly vulnerable community members. Elderly residents or families with infants might move between houses during the coldest periods, spreading the heating burden across multiple households. The Miller family stayed with us for 2 weeks during the February freeze, wrote James Peterson of Iowa. Then they moved to the Hansons for 2 weeks, then the Johnsons. By sharing the burden, no single family exhausted their fuel supplies. We all made it to March, though by God it was a close thing. In some communities, heating became literally centralized. A large communal space, often a church or school, would be kept warm around the clock. Families would gather there during the day, returning to their own minimally heated homes only for sleeping. We spent every day that January in the meeting house, recalled Thomas King of his childhood in Nebraska. Each family brought what fuel they could spare. The men took turns feeding the stove. Women cooked in shifts on the same fire. At night, the oldest and youngest stayed there while the rest went home to cold houses and piled under quilts until morning. This communal approach to heating reflected a fundamental frontier truth. In the harshest environments, cooperation wasn't just nice, it was necessary for survival. Pride, privacy, and property rights all took a back seat to the simple imperative of staying alive until spring. A wall of white engulfs the cabin, the blizzard so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. Outside, the temperature has dropped to 40 below. Inside, the family clusters around their small stove, feeding it precious fuel one careful piece at a time. They speak little saving energy and heat. The walls creak and moan under the storm's assault. Will it hold? A child whispers. It's held for 3 winters. The father answers, it'll hold for this one too. In these moments of extreme challenge, frontier families found reserves of strength and ingenuity they never knew they possessed. They burned furniture when fuel ran out. They burned books, painful sacrifices for literate families who treasured their few volumes. When nothing else remained, they burned parts of their own homes, non-essential interior walls or floorboards from unused rooms. We burned the cradle, wrote Sarah Miller of the terrible winter of 1886. The children were grown, and it was just seasoned wood sitting in the corner. Still, I cried as my husband broke it apart. It had held all our babies, but better to burn the cradle than bury a child. The battle against cold shaped everything about frontier life. It dictated home design, daily routines, community structures, and psychological outlooks. The cold was always there, always waiting for a mistake, a miscalculation, a stroke of bad luck. Yet somehow, these ordinary people, farmers, housewives, children, found ways to push back against nature's harshest season. They improvised, adapted, and overcame challenges that would overwhelm most modern Americans. As you lie there in your perfectly heated bedroom, it's worth remembering that the gulf between their lives and yours is just a few generations wide. The knowledge they painfully acquired, what burns, what insulates, what strategies preserve heat and life, laid the foundation for our modern understanding of thermal management. Their desperate struggles gave us practical lessons that architects and engineers still use today. More importantly, they left us stories of incredible resilience, reminders of what humans can endure and overcome when necessity demands it. But even with adequate shelter and heat, frontier settlers faced another deadly challenge, the cold outside their doors, because eventually everyone had to venture out to care for animals, gather fuel, or travel to town for supplies, and when they did, their only protection against the killing cold was what they wore. The clothing that had served them well in eastern states became death traps on the prairie. The fashionable cotton garments from Philadelphia or Boston turned lethal when soaked with sweat or snow. Settlers who failed to adapt their wardrobes faced swift and terrible consequences, frostbite claiming fingers and toes within minutes, followed by hypothermia's deadly progression. Those who survived the harshest winters were those who learned to dress for survival, not style, and once again the most successful frontier families were those willing to abandon Eastern traditions and adopt techniques developed by those who understood this landscape best. Stepping outside during a Dakota winter was like walking into another world, one designed to kill you. Your breath instantly crystallized, your nostrils froze shut if you inhaled too quickly. The wind didn't just blow, it punched through whatever you were wearing and went straight for your core. And in this frozen battlefield, clothing wasn't fashion. It was your portable shelter, your personal fortress against death. I sent my husband to check the livestock wearing his Philadelphia coat, wrote Margaret Wilson in 1883. He came back with his arms frozen to the elbows. The doctor took 3 fingers from his left hand, 2 from his right, all because of a coat that was fine for an eastern winter but worthless here. That mistake, treating frontier winters like harsher versions of eastern cold, killed countless settlers during their first years on the plains. The clothing that had served them perfectly well in Boston or New York became death traps in Dakota or Nebraska. Cotton was the biggest culprit. Back east, cotton clothing was comfortable and practical. On the frontier, it was a killer. Once dampened by sweat or snow, cotton loses all insulating properties. Worse, it actively pulls heat from the body as it dries. A settler who worked up a sweat in cotton garments might feel fine while active, then rapidly succumb to hypothermia once they stopped moving. I found him half a mile from the house, wrote Thomas Peterson about his neighbour. He'd been cutting wood and walked home in just his shirt. The sweat had frozen solid. He was like a statue, still on his feet with the axe over his shoulder, frozen right where he stood when the cold finally reached his heart. Her hands, wrapped in rabbit fur mittens, are the only part of her not yet numb with cold. The harsh prairie wind howls around her, but her fingers remain warm, the difference between completing her chores and losing digits to frostbite. You're probably thinking, wait, didn't they know basic winter survival? But remember, most settlers came from places with relatively mild winters. They had no frame of reference for temperatures that could drop to 40 below, no concept of wind that could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. The settlers who survived were those who adapted rapidly, often by embracing the wisdom of those who understood this harsh landscape best, the native peoples who'd been living here for generations. "I thought my winter clothes from Vermont would suffice," wrote John Hamilton. "The Lakota men who saw me preparing for winter laughed openly. One made a throat-cutting gesture. I was offended until my first ride in November. I nearly died 3 miles from home when my fine wool coat proved about as useful as tissue paper against the Dakota wind." After that experience, Hamilton swallowed his pride and asked for help. The local Lakota showed him how to properly prepare for winter on the plains. The lessons were often counterintuitive to Eastern sensibilities, but proven by generations of survival. The first principle was layering. Rather than relying on a single thick garment, frontier veterans adopted multiple thin layers that created insulating air pockets between them. This approach trapped body heat with remarkable efficiency while allowing crucial adaptability as work intensity or temperatures changed. "The old trapper showed me to wear 3 thin shirts instead of 1 thick one," wrote Michael Donovan, said the spaces between them held heat better than solid cloth, thought he was pulling my leg until I tried it. Difference between night and day. As activity intensified and body temperature rose, layers could be removed to prevent sweating, then added back when activity ceased. This prevented the deadly cooling effect of wet clothes against skin. The second principle involved material choice. Wool emerged as the frontiersman's most valuable textile. Unlike cotton, wool maintains up to 80% of its insulating capacity even when soaked through. This remarkable property made the difference between life and death during unexpected storms or when crossing frozen rivers. "Fell through the ice crossing the creek," Samuel Johnson recorded in 1885. "Soaked to my chest in water cold enough to steal your breath. Would have died right there if not for my wool garments. Stayed warm enough to get home, though my clothes froze solid as boards before I reached the door." Leather, properly treated, became the frontier's armor against wind. A good leather coat with tight seams could block the prairie gales that cut through conventional fabric like it wasn't there, but the leather required careful maintenance to remain useful. "Father spent every evening working fat into his boots," recalled Anna Peterson. "His hands would be slick with tallow, rubbing and kneading until the leather was soft. He'd say, 'Stiff boots are dead boots, and dead boots mean dead feet.'" These treatments transformed ordinary garments into sophisticated winter armor that maintained crucial flexibility while repelling moisture. But perhaps the most dramatic clothing adaptations came when settlers completely abandoned their cultural pride and adopted indigenous garments perfected over thousands of years. Native American moccasins lined with rabbit fur provided insulation far superior to European-style boots. They allowed critical feeling and flexion that prevented trips and falls, a major cause of winter deaths when the injured couldn't get back to shelter. "Indian moccasins saved my toes," wrote William Foster in 1884. "My fine Boston boots were like blocks of wood in real cold. Couldn't feel the ground, couldn't tell if my feet were freezing. Switched to moccasins lined with rabbit fur, could feel everything, and my feet stayed warm even at 20 below." The transition wasn't always easy. Many settlers resisted adopting savage garments out of cultural prejudice or simple pride. Some paid for that resistance with fingers, toes, or lives. Henderson refused to wear Injun boots, as he called them, wrote Thomas Black about his neighbour, said no civilized man would be caught dead in such things. Ironic choice of words, as it turned out. They found him frozen in a drift that spring. His fancy leather boots still looked nice, though his feet inside them were black with frostbite. For those who did adapt, the results could be startling. Moccasins, fur-lined mittens, leather outer garments with wool layers beneath. This combination allowed frontiersmen to function in conditions that would incapacitate or kill the unprepared. The leather is so frozen it stands upright on its own like some grotesque sculpture. The farmer's boots, left outside the cabin overnight by mistake, have transformed into wood-hard containers that cannot be worn until warmed by the fire. A simple error that could cost toes or a life if there's urgent work waiting outside. "My mother wore clothes that would have scandalized her Boston family," wrote Emma Johnson. Fur-lined leggings under her skirts, rabbit-skin mittens, a hat made from raccoon with the tail still attached. She'd say, better to look a wild woman than be a dead lady. Perhaps most critical were the seemingly minor design choices that determined survival. The simple choice between mittens and gloves could preserve or cost fingers. Mittens kept fingers together, creating shared warmth that maintained circulation. Separated fingers in gloves quickly lost heat and froze. "Lost 2 fingers my first winter," recalled John Peterson. "Wore my fine leather gloves to fix the barn door. Would have kept all my digits if I'd used mittens like my wife suggested. She never let me forget it either." Even the arrangement of garments followed specific strategies. Outer layers were often left loose to trap additional air for insulation. Layers were carefully overlapped to prevent wind from finding gaps. Scarves were wrapped in complex patterns that protected the face while still allowing breath to escape without freezing the covering. "Took me 3 winters to learn how to dress properly," wrote Lars Olsen. "First winter, nearly died. Second winter was merely miserable. Third winter, finally stayed comfortable enough to actually get work done instead of just fighting to survive." These lessons were often passed from veterans to newcomers, creating an informal education system that saved countless lives. Experienced settlers would watch for the telltale signs of inadequate winter preparation and intervene before tragedy struck. "The Miller family arrived in October with cotton coats and thin gloves," wrote Sarah Peterson. "Johnson rode over same day and brought them 3 sheep worth of wool and a pile of rabbit skins. Start sewing, he told them, or start planning funerals." Even with proper clothing, the frontier winter imposed strict limitations. There were temperatures at which no amount of protection was sufficient for extended exposure. During the worst cold snaps, when temperatures dropped below 30 below zero, most activity outside simply ceased. 3 days we've been trapped inside," reads a diary entry from February 1882. "The cold is something from hell itself. Spit freezes before it hits the ground. We've nailed blankets over the windows and stuffed rags in every crack. The animals will have to fend for themselves until it breaks." During these killing cold periods, necessary outdoor chores were planned with military precision. Multiple layers were donned, paths were pre-cleared, tasks were rehearsed mentally to minimize time exposed. "Father would count the steps to the barn," remembered Thomas Johnson. Knew exactly how long it would take, exactly what needed doing. He'd dress for 20 minutes to be outside for 10. There was no margin for error when the air itself seemed eager to freeze your lungs. Even routine trips became survival exercises during winter storms. The journey to town for supplies, a simple half-day excursion in summer, transformed into a life-or-death gamble in winter months. The Wallace family learned this lesson in the harshest possible way in January 1878. Charles Wallace, an experienced frontiersman who'd lived in Minnesota for 5 years, set out for the trading post 10 miles away. The morning was clear and relatively mild, only about 10 below zero, with moderate wind. Charles knew the dangers, his wife Mary wrote afterward. He took every precaution: wool layers, fur-lined moccasins, face wrap, mittens, food and extra blankets in the wagon, though he expected to return the same day. 2 miles from town, the weather changed with the frightening speed so common on the plains. The temperature plummeted, the wind intensified, snow began falling, then blowing horizontally. Within an hour, Charles found himself in whiteout conditions, the trail disappearing beneath fresh powder. "I almost turned back when the storm hit," he wrote in his own account. "Should have, but I was closer to town than home by then, and we needed the supplies badly, thought I could make it. Foolish pride." As visibility dropped to near zero, Charles lost the trail. His wagon became stuck in a drift. The horse, panicking in the intensifying storm, broke free and ran off, disappearing into the white void. Alone, with the temperature dropping by the minute, Charles faced a classic frontier survival decision: stay with the shelter of his wagon or try to walk to safety. Both choices carried deadly risks. "I knew the statistics," he wrote. "Men who left their wagons were usually found frozen within 100 yards. Men who stayed often survived if properly dressed, but without the horse, I had no way to free the wagon when the storm passed, and it might last days." Charles made his choice. He gathered everything useful from the wagon: blankets, food, matches, his rifle. He fashioned a walking stick with a hook at the end to feel for the trail beneath the snow. Then he set out toward town, the last place he knew for certain. "Every instinct screamed to hurry," he recalled, but experience whispered to move slowly, deliberately. Running meant sweat. Sweat meant freezing. So I shuffled forward one careful step at a time, probing with my stick, fighting the wind with each movement. The storm intensified. The snow became so thick that Charles couldn't see his own feet. The wind drove ice crystals against any exposed skin like tiny needles. His world narrowed to a bubble, extending just inches beyond his body. "I began talking to myself to stay focused," he wrote, counting steps, reciting Bible verses, anything to keep my mind working. "When I found myself growing confused, I recognized the early signs of hypothermia. In his increasingly disoriented state, Charles made a critical error. He veered from his course, missing the town by nearly a mile. Instead of safety, he wandered deeper into the open prairie as darkness fell. Night coming on in a blizzard strips away hope like nothing else," he wrote. "Can't see, can't hear over the wind, temperature dropping by the minute. I knew my chances were dwindling with the light." With darkness complete and his strength failing, Charles stumbled upon a creek bed, a depression in the landscape that offered marginal protection from the wind. He immediately recognized his opportunity. "The bank was steep enough to block the worst of the gale," he recalled. "I dug into a drift, creating a snow cave of sorts against the creek bank, used blankets to create an entrance flap. Inside, out of the direct wind, the temperature was merely freezing instead of fatal." This snow shelter, combined with his proper clothing and survival knowledge, kept Charles alive through a night that claimed several lives across the region. He kept moving inside the small space, slapping his hands and feet to maintain circulation. He allowed himself only brief periods of sleep to avoid succumbing to the deadly comfort of hypothermia. "The worst part was the second guessing," he wrote. "Should I have stayed with the wagon? Did I go the wrong direction? Would my family survive if I didn't return? Your mind becomes your enemy in such moments." Blood returns to white fingers, bringing pain so intense he bites through his lip to keep from screaming. The settler's hands, death pale and hard as wood, gradually flush angry red as they warm by the fire. His wife watches anxiously, knowing that this color, painful as it is, means he'll keep his fingers. This time. "Don't rub them," she warns sharply when he reaches for his thawing hands. "Hurts like hell," he growls through clenched teeth. "Better hurt than gone," she answers, and they both know she's right. Morning brought a brief respite in the storm. With better visibility, Charles realized he'd missed the town and backtracked, finally reaching the trading post around noon. The shopkeeper barely recognized him. His beard was a solid mass of ice, his eyebrows white with frost, his face red and swollen from wind exposure. Wallace arrived looking like death itself. The shopkeeper wrote in his own account that he survived the night alone in such conditions borders on miraculous. His clothing saved him, layers of wool and fur that kept the worst cold at bay. Charles remained at the trading post for 3 days until the blizzard finally passed. He procured another horse, loaded his supplies, and made the journey home without further incident. The experience left him with minor frostbite on his face and a profound respect for winter's power. "I did everything right except for one decision," he wrote afterward, "and that nearly killed me. The margin for error in winter is that small." The Wallace story spread through the region, reinforcing critical lessons about winter travel and clothing. Charles began speaking at community gatherings before winter set in, sharing his experience and techniques that had kept him alive. "Dress as if you'll be sleeping in a snowbank," he would tell new settlers, "because you might be." This practical wisdom, born of harsh experience, was typical of frontier communities. Those who survived shared their knowledge freely, creating an oral tradition of winter clothing strategies that compensated for the inadequate preparation most Easterners brought with them. These handmade frontier garments weren't just practical, they represented a fundamental cultural adaptation. Each mitten sewn from rabbit fur, each pair of wool leggings, each carefully treated leather coat was a tacit admission that Eastern ways wouldn't work here. That survival required new approaches, new materials, new techniques. The clothing evolution mirrored the larger transformation that successful settlers underwent, from confident Easterners bringing civilization to the wilderness to humbled students learning from the land and its original inhabitants. "My wife arrived in Montana wearing silk dresses and fine leather shoes," wrote James Richardson in 1887. 5 years later, she dressed more like a Crow woman than a Boston lady, and she was alive, which many fine Boston ladies who came west were not. By the mid-1880s, a distinctive frontier clothing style had emerged, a hybrid that combined European garment types with Native American materials and techniques. Wool and fur predominated. Layers were standard. Mittens, not gloves, covered hands. Moccasins often replaced boots. The most successful settlers developed what might be called a clothing system rather than just individual garments. Every piece worked together, overlapping to prevent gaps where cold could penetrate. Options for different activities and temperatures were maintained. Garments were carefully stored, when not in use, protected from moisture and vermin. "My mother kept our winter clothes in special chests through summer," recalled Emma Johnson, "wrapped in cloth with tobacco leaves to keep moths away. She checked them monthly, repairing any damage immediately. Our lives depended on those garments and she treated them accordingly." As you lie in your warm bed, perhaps wearing comfortable cotton pajamas, the very material that could kill you on the frontier, it's worth reflecting on how thoroughly we've forgotten these hard-earned lessons, how completely our climate-controlled world has disconnected us from the knowledge that kept our ancestors alive. Those mittens, moccasins, and wool layers represented more than just clothing choices. They embodied a fundamental frontier truth. Survival required adaptation, humility, and willingness to learn from those who came before. Those who clung to Eastern ways, Eastern clothing, Eastern pride rarely lived to see their second winter. But even the most perfectly dressed settler still faced the greatest winter challenge of all, food, because no matter how warm your clothing or how well heated your home, without adequate nourishment, the body's internal furnace would sputter and die. And on the isolated frontier, with no grocery stores or restaurants, winter food security meant the difference between life and death. When we think about frontier survival, we often focus on the dramatic, the blizzards, the freezing temperatures, the physical dangers, but in many ways the greatest winter challenge was much quieter, keeping enough food on the table to make it to spring. Unlike your midnight snack waiting in the fridge, frontier food couldn't be taken for granted. There were no grocery stores, no restaurants, no delivery services. What you managed to grow, gather, hunt and preserve before winter was all you had. No second chances, no restocking. The root cellar's earthy darkness cradles what remains of their winter stores. 3 potatoes and a wizened turnip. The woman holds the lantern higher, its light revealing empty shelves where food should be. February has barely begun, and already they're facing the abyss. Our first winter, we ate bark soup by March, wrote Caroline Peterson of her family's experience in Minnesota. Boiled tree bark with a handful of flour and whatever dried herbs remained. Tasted like despair, but it kept us breathing. Underground beneath many frontier homes lay the first line of defense against starvation. Root cellars functioned as life insurance policies dug into the earth, where temperatures remained just above freezing regardless of the brutal conditions above. "Father dug our cellar 7 feet deep," recalled Emma Johnson. "Said the devil himself couldn't freeze food that far underground. Turns out he was right. Even when it hit 40 below outside, the cellar stayed cold but never frosted." These subterranean vaults preserved vegetables through the darkest months, providing crucial nutrition when the body needed it most. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, anything that could be stored without spoiling was carefully arranged on shelves or in barrels filled with sand. The engineering was remarkably sophisticated for seemingly simple structures. The best root cellars had ventilation systems that could be adjusted based on outside conditions. Too cold? Close the vents to trap Earth's natural warmth. Too warm? Open them to allow cool air circulation. Our cellar had little wooden channels built into the walls, Thomas Black wrote. Father could open or close them from inside the house, said it was like having a primitive refrigerator, only it ran on common sense instead of electricity. Temperature wasn't the only consideration. Humidity mattered too. Too dry and root vegetables would shrivel and harden. Too damp and they'd rot. The ideal root cellar maintained a delicate balance, cool enough to slow spoilage but not so cold as to freeze, humid enough to prevent drying but not so wet as to encourage mold. Some vegetables required special treatment. Cabbages were often pulled up with roots intact and hung upside down from cellar ceiling beams. Onions needed drier conditions than potatoes and were typically stored in mesh bags or braided into strings. Apples were kept separate from other produce because they release ethylene gas that speeds ripening and spoilage. Mother had a system, recalled John Peterson. Potatoes in sand barrels in the northwest corner, carrots and beets in the northeast where it was slightly damper, onions and garlic hung from the centre beam, cabbages along the south wall. She knew where every vegetable belonged, like they were children with assigned beds. This careful organisation wasn't fussiness, it was survival science. A family that properly maintained their root cellar might have fresh vegetables into March or April. Those who didn't might be eating bark soup by February. But even the best stocked root cellar couldn't provide complete nutrition through winter. Preserving additional food through other methods became a critical complement. The fermentation arsenal transformed ordinary vegetables into survival rations that increased rather than diminished in nutritional value over time. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and various vegetables were preserved in carefully prepared brine solutions. Sauerkraut saved more frontier lives than doctors ever did, declared Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who settled in Nebraska in the 1870s. A spoonful daily keeps scurvy away. Simple as that. He wasn't exaggerating. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, posed a serious threat during winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. Fermented foods like sauerkraut provided crucial nutrients that prevented the disease's devastating effects: bleeding gums, reopening of old wounds, eventual organ failure and death. The preservation process began in autumn, immediately after harvest. Cabbage would be shredded, salted, and packed tightly into crocks or barrels. The salt drew out moisture, creating a brine that preserved the cabbage while allowing beneficial bacteria to transform it into sauerkraut. Mother's fall ritual was the sauerkraut making, wrote Emma Johnson, shredding cabbage until her hands bled, pounding it down with a wooden mallet, checking the crocks daily for weeks. She made at least 4 barrels every year, said she'd rather have too much than watch her children's teeth fall out from scurvy. Meat preservation presented different challenges. Without refrigeration, fresh meat was a brief luxury, available only immediately after a successful hunt or animal slaughter. The rest had to be preserved through smoking, drying, or salting. Jerky, thin strips of meat dried until most moisture was removed, became a staple in many frontier households. The process was simple but required careful attention. Meat was cut into uniform thin strips, treated with salt, and hung in a well-ventilated area to dry. Made jerky in September every year, wrote Charles Wallace. 30 pounds of venison, 15 of beef if we had it. Hung the strips from kitchen rafters for 2 weeks. House smelled like a tannery, but that jerky kept us going through more than one lean period. Salt pork and salt beef provided another preservation option. Meat was packed in barrels or crocks with layers of salt, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. The resulting preserved meat was extremely salty and often required soaking before cooking, but it remained edible for months. The salt pork barrel was our bank account, recalled Thomas Peterson. Father would check it weekly, calculating how many weeks remained until spring. Some winters we ate well. Others he'd shave off pieces thin as paper to make it stretch. She carves paper-thin slices of salt pork, stretching the last of it to feed 6 hungry mouths. The translucent pieces barely cover the bread. Everyone pretends not to notice how little there is. A collective fiction that somehow makes it easier to bear. Will there be more tomorrow? A child asks. The mother's hands pause. There's always enough, she answers, though everyone at the table knows it's a lie. But perhaps the most complete nutritional technology adopted by frontier settlers was pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, animal fat, and berries that created a perfect survival food containing all necessary nutrients. Pemmican sits like a dark brick in his palm, concentrated survival you can hold in one hand. The mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and berries doesn't look appetizing, but it will keep a body going for days when nothing else is available. Looks like something the dog wouldn't eat, the man admits, with a half smile. Tastes about the same too, but I've seen it keep men alive when everything else ran out. Originally developed by Native American tribes, pemmican was adopted by fur traders, explorers, and eventually settlers who recognized its unparalleled value for winter survival. The Johnson family of Nebraska Territory credited their survival during the blizzard of 1857 to the pemmican stores they had prepared following advice from Pawnee neighbors, wrote historian Edward Richards in 1899. A single pouch sustained each family member for days when trapped indoors without fresh supplies. The creation of pemmican was labor-intensive but worth the effort. Meat, usually bison, elk, deer, or beef, was cut into thin strips and thoroughly dried until brittle. Then it was pounded into a powder and mixed with rendered animal fat. Dried berries might be added for flavor and additional nutrition. The mixture was packed into rawhide containers where it could remain edible for years. A single pound of pemmican contained approximately 3,000 calories and enough nutrients to sustain an active adult for multiple days. It could be eaten as is or cooked into stews or soups as conditions allowed. "We made 50 pounds every fall," wrote Michael Hamilton, who learned the technique from Lakota neighbors. "Took a week of work, drying the meat, rendering the fat, pounding it all together. But that pemmican saw us through 3 different blizzards when we couldn't reach our main food stores. Worth every hour of labor." The settlers who survived multiple winters developed calculated nutritional defense systems. They stored specific food varieties that addressed predictable threats the body faced during cold months. Vitamin C-rich preserves counteracted scurvy, while protein-dense preparations maintained muscle mass and the body's ability to generate heat. This frontier nutrition wasn't just about having enough calories, it was about having the right types of nutrients to maintain health through months of confinement and cold. "Mother portioned everything," recalled Sarah Johnson. "Each day had its ration of meat, vegetables, preserved fruit." She understood that balance mattered, not just quantity. Said a family could starve to death with full bellies if they ate the wrong things. Food preservation became a mathematical science of survival. Families calculated exactly how many pounds of dried meat, bushels of potatoes, and jars of preserved fruits would sustain each person through winter isolation. Careful rationing systems emerged with daily portions, measured precisely to ensure supplies would last. "Father kept a ledger," wrote Thomas Black. "Every Sunday night he'd count everything remaining in our stores, do calculations on how many weeks until spring, adjust rations accordingly. Some weeks we'd feast, others we'd barely get by, but we never ran out completely." The margin for error remained frighteningly thin. Rodents getting into grain stores or unexpected mold in preserved vegetables could tip the balance from survival to starvation. What separated survivors from those who perished was often the quality and diversity of stored food. "The Williams family made it through the hard winter," wrote the Dakota Territory Gazette in April 1881, while the Johnsons, just a mile away, lost 2 children to hunger. The difference wasn't luck, it was preparation. Williams had twice the variety in their cellar and a better rationing system. When supplies ran dangerously low, frontier families turned to desperate alternatives. Tree bark, particularly from pines and cottonwoods, could be processed into an edible, if unappetizing, substance. Certain lichens provided minimal nutrition. In areas near water, ice fishing offered a potential lifeline, even in the depths of winter. The Pearson family of Minnesota faced this food crisis during the winter of 1887-1888. By February, their carefully managed stores had dwindled to nearly nothing. A family of 6, parents and 4 children, were subsisting on increasingly meager rations. "We had 3 potatoes, half a cabbage, and a handful of cornmeal left," wrote Margaret Pearson. 4 months of careful planning undone by mice in the root cellar that spoiled half our stores by December. Thomas calculated we had perhaps a week before real starvation began. Thomas Pearson made a desperate decision. Despite the brutal cold, he would attempt to ice fish on the nearby lake. It was dangerous work in February. The ice was thick enough to support a man, but the temperatures could kill through exposure in a matter of hours. Father fashioned special tools, recalled young James Pearson, who was 9 that winter. A chisel made from an old file to cut through ice, a covered bucket to keep the fishing hole from freezing over, hooks made from bent needles. He worked all night preparing. The next morning, Thomas set out before dawn, wrapped in every piece of warm clothing the family owned. He took a small sled to carry his equipment and, hopefully, bring back fish. "I watched him disappear into the darkness," Margaret wrote, "prayed harder than I'd ever prayed. Our children's lives depended on what he brought back." Thomas spent 14 hours on the frozen lake that day. The temperature never rose above 0. Wind cut across the exposed ice like a blade. He chopped 6 holes, moving periodically as each one proved unproductive. "Thought I might die out there," he wrote afterward. "Fingers and toes went numb despite my best precautions, kept thinking of the children's faces, kept chopping new holes when fish wouldn't bite." In the early afternoon, his persistence paid off. He found a spot where crappie and bluegill were schooling. Over the next 5 hours, he pulled 47 fish through the ice, enough to feed his family for at least 2 weeks. "When I saw him coming back in the dusk, I knew by his walk that he'd succeeded," Margaret recorded. "He was bent under the weight of the sled, now laden with frozen fish. I ran out to meet him, not caring about the cold. We both wept as we counted his catch." The Pearsons survived that winter through a combination of ice fishing, careful rationing, and community support. Neighbours who had slightly more abundant stores shared what they could, creating a mutual insurance system against starvation. This community food sharing became a critical survival mechanism across the frontier. Settlements established practices where families with surplus regularly contributed to those facing temporary shortages. This approach created resilience against the unpredictable nature of frontier harvests, where a single crop failure could mean starvation without community support. "We established the common pantry in 83, wrote James Peterson of the Brookings settlement. Each family contributed a percentage of their winter stores to a communal reserve held in the church root cellar. If any family faced true need, they could draw from this reserve with the understanding they'd repay in future seasons." These frontier food banks weren't charity in the modern sense. They were practical survival systems based on the recognition that everyone was vulnerable to misfortune, and a community was stronger when it ensured no family faced starvation alone. The Norton family's root cellar flooded in November of 85, Peterson recorded, lost most of their potatoes and all their carrots. Would have been a death sentence without the common pantry. They drew enough to survive the winter, then contributed double their share for the next 3 years in repayment. These systems reflected the frontier understanding that individual households couldn't guarantee their own survival against all possible disasters. Collective food security provided insurance that no single family could create alone. In some communities, this cooperation extended to specialized food production. Families with particular skills or resources would focus on specific preservation methods, then trade with others who specialized differently. "The Germans excelled at sauerkraut and sausage making," wrote Thomas Miller of his Iowa settlement. "The Swedes made the best dried fish. The English women's jam couldn't be matched. Each family produced what they did best, then traded for what they needed. Together we created a winter diet more varied than any single family could manage." This specialization allowed communities to maximize the nutritional value and variety of their winter food stores while making efficient use of limited preservation resources. "Mrs. Hanson had the biggest kitchen and the best drying racks," recalled Emma Johnson, "so every family brought their apple harvest to her house. For 6 weeks in autumn, her kitchen ran day and night, with women taking shifts to keep the drying process going. In exchange for the use of her space, she kept 1/10 of everyone's dried apples." a fair arrangement that benefited all. Beyond these formal systems, frontier communities developed cultural traditions around food sharing that helped everyone survive. Communal meals during the darkest part of winter boosted morale while ensuring that families with dwindling supplies still received adequate nutrition. Every Sunday from January through March, we gathered at the schoolhouse, wrote Caroline Peterson. Each family brought what they could, sometimes much, sometimes little. Everything was combined into stews or soups that fed the entire settlement. No one went home hungry, even if their own pantry was bare. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided crucial psychological support during the most depressing part of winter. They ensured that children and the elderly received at least one substantial meal per week, and they allowed the community to assess which families might need additional help without forcing proud settlers to openly ask for assistance. As the winter progressed and supplies dwindled, these communal meals often became simpler but remained vital community touchstones. By late February, our Sunday gatherings were sometimes little more than potato soup and cornbread, Peterson wrote, but we came together nonetheless, sang songs, told stories, remembered that we weren't alone in our struggle. The psychological aspect of winter food security couldn't be overstated. The knowledge that there was enough, or the fear that there wasn't, shaped every aspect of frontier winter life. The constant calculations wore on the mind, wrote Charles Wallace, counting potatoes, measuring flour, weighing meat, always with the same question hovering. Will it be enough? Will we see spring? The physical hunger was painful, but the worry beforehand was its own form of torture. When supplies did run low, the physical effects cascaded quickly, a body receiving insufficient calories in extreme cold burns through its reserves at an accelerated rate. Muscle mass diminishes, mental function declines, the ability to generate internal heat falters just when it's needed most. First you're hungry, then you're weak. Then you're confused, wrote a survivor of the hard winter of 1880-81. By the time the confusion sets in, you're already dying. Your body is consuming itself from the inside out. Children and the elderly suffered first and most severely. Their smaller or frailer bodies had fewer reserves to draw upon. In many frontier families, adults would reduce their own rations to ensure the youngest and oldest members received enough, a sacrifice that sometimes led to their own debilitation. Mother stopped eating anything but thin soup by February, recalled Sarah Johnson. Said she wasn't hungry, but her clothes hung on her like sacks. She gave everything to us children. By spring thaw, she couldn't stand without assistance. Took months for her to regain her strength. Even when actual starvation was avoided, the nutritional deficiencies of a limited winter diet took their toll. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, pellagra from niacin shortage, night blindness from lack of vitamin A. These conditions weakened settlers, making them more vulnerable to cold, disease, and accidents. Half the frontier graves were dug not for those who froze or starved outright, wrote Dr. James Henderson in his 1896 medical memoir, but for those whose bodies were so undermined by winter malnutrition that they succumbed to illnesses they might otherwise have survived. Yet, despite these challenges, the majority of frontier families developed systems that allowed them to endure winter after winter. They learned which foods preserved best, which provided the most nutrition for the least space, which could be stretched furthest in times of scarcity. As you rest comfortably in your bed, perhaps considering a snack waiting just steps away, it's worth reflecting on how completely this aspect of survival has vanished from our experience. The desperate mathematics of winter calories, the constant awareness of dwindling supplies, the community bonds forged by shared vulnerability to hunger. These frontier families didn't just survive winter, they created sophisticated food systems that sustained not just their bodies but their communities through the darkest, coldest months. And in doing so, they demonstrated perhaps the most important survival lesson of all: that collective resilience far outstrips individual effort when facing nature's harshest challenges. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important element of frontier winter survival, the community itself, because when all other resources failed, when homes couldn't keep out the cold, when fires went out, when food ran short, it was human connection that often made the difference between life and death on the American frontier. In the depths of frontier winter, when all other resources failed, the greatest survival tool wasn't a well-built home or a clever heating system or even adequate food stores. It was the community itself, the human connections that turned individual vulnerability into collective strength. There's a saying that came from those years, wrote Sarah Peterson in 1905, looking back on her frontier experience. A lone settler was a dead settler. Sounds harsh, but winter proved it true time and again. The historical record bears out her assessment. Isolated homesteaders vanished beneath the snow at a far higher rate than those who lived in settlements. The bitter Minnesota winter of 1856-57 delivered a stark lesson when temperatures remained at 40 below for weeks. While isolated homesteaders died by the dozens, settlements where families united against the cold emerged intact despite equally brutal conditions. This pattern repeated across the frontier, revealing a fundamental truth that many proud pioneers refused to acknowledge until too late. Those who faced winter alone rarely lived to tell their tale. Consider the case of William Evans, who claimed a homestead in Dakota Territory in 1879, 15 miles from the nearest settlement. Evans was no greenhorn. He'd spent years in the mountains of Colorado and considered himself thoroughly versed in winter survival. When neighbors invited him to move closer for the winter, he declined. Evans told me he'd be fine on his own, wrote Thomas Johnson, said he'd survived worse in the Rockies. I tried explaining that Dakota winter was different, but he just laughed, said he wasn't some helpless city boy who needed to huddle with strangers. Evans built a solid cabin, gathered ample fuel, and stored food carefully. By all accounts, he was well prepared, but what he couldn't account for was the psychological toll of isolation combined with winter's physical threats. We found him in April when the snow melted, Johnson recorded. Cabin was intact, food still in the cellar, fuel stacked neatly, but Evans was in his bed, dead since January according to the diary entries. No signs of injury or illness, just stopped writing one day. Doctor said he likely just gave up, lost the will to keep fighting alone. This phenomenon, sometimes called cabin fever, but more accurately described as a combination of depression, anxiety, and sensory deprivation, claimed countless frontier lives. Human beings, it turns out, aren't meant to endure extended isolation, particularly when combined with darkness, cold, and constant danger. The mind needs company like the body needs food, wrote Dr. James Henderson in 1883. I've seen strong men waste away in winter isolation despite adequate physical provisions. The spirit starves when deprived of human contact. Children's bodies, found frozen in prayer positions, are laid out in the schoolhouse like terrible dolls. Parents move between them in stunned silence, searching for their own. Some collapse when they find what they're looking for, others when they don't. "I'll never forget the sight," whispered Reverend Svensson later. "God forgive me, but I've seen battlefields that were easier to bear than that room of frozen children." The children's blizzard of 1888 brought this lesson home with terrible clarity. The storm struck without warning on an unusually mild January day. Children who had gone to school in light clothing found themselves trapped as temperatures plummeted and hurricane-force winds drove snow horizontally across the landscape. Some teachers made heroic efforts to save their students. Minnie Freeman in Nebraska tied her 17 pupils together with rope and led them through the blizzard to safety. Others barricaded schoolhouse doors and maintained fires until help arrived or the storm passed. But many children attempted to walk home, becoming disoriented in the whiteout conditions. Some were found frozen just yards from safety, having walked in circles until exhaustion and cold claimed them. The Anderson children were found half a mile from their home, reported the Dakota Territory Gazette on January 20th, 1888. The oldest boy, age 12, had placed his coat around his 7-year-old sister and curled his body around her. Both perished, his final act one of sacrifice. The communities struck by this tragedy responded with profound solidarity. Funeral expenses were shared. Orphaned children were taken in without question. Families who lost children received food, fuel, and support from neighbors who understood that grief compounded winter's physical challenges. "After we buried our Sophie, I couldn't function," wrote Margaret Hanson. "Couldn't cook, couldn't clean, could barely rise from bed. For 6 weeks, neighbor women came daily. They fed my surviving children, maintained our fire, preserved our household. Their hands did what mine couldn't while grief consumed me." This instinctive community response to tragedy reflected a deeper frontier truth. Survival required cooperation. The independent spirit that drove westward expansion proved deadly during winter's grip. Cultural differences and fierce self-reliance had to be set aside when snow buried the landscape. Communities that survived developed sophisticated cooperative systems that addressed every aspect of winter's threat. These were formalized practices that evolved specifically to keep everyone alive through the deadliest months. Consider the winter watch system that emerged in many settlements by the 1880s. Each morning during extreme cold periods, designated watchers would check every home in the community for signs of life. Smoke from chimneys, tracks in the snow, lights in windows. "Johnson and I split the north side of the settlement," wrote Thomas Peterson of the winter of 1887, "checked 23 homes each morning before sunrise. If we saw no smoke or other signs, we'd knock. If no answer came, we'd enter. Found the Williams family unconscious from coal gas one morning. Doctor said another hour would have been too late." These watch systems, simple as they were, saved countless lives. They ensured that medical emergencies, fuel exhaustion, or food crises were discovered before they proved fatal. Beyond this basic monitoring, settlements developed elaborate mutual aid practices. Frontier communities organized cooperative snow clearing, maintaining paths between homes and to essential resources like wells and barns. This shared labor meant that even the elderly, or those with limited physical capability, could maintain access to their necessities. Each man in Brookings was assigned 2 paths to maintain after storms, recalled James Peterson. "Mine were from my home to the Johnsons, and from the Johnsons to the community well. No matter how deep the snow, those paths were kept clear. If a man fell ill, others took his paths without being asked. The network connected every household to every other." Fuel sharing became another crucial community practice. Many settlements established emergency wood or buffalo chip reserves that could be accessed by families whose own supplies ran dangerously low. The Fuel Committee maintained what we called the last resort pile, wrote Charles Wallace of his Minnesota settlement. Every family contributed a percentage of their winter fuel. The pile was strictly for emergencies. If your supply was exhausted and no other option existed, using it carried no shame, only the obligation to contribute double your share the following year. These systems recognized that individual misfortune or miscalculation shouldn't carry a death sentence. By distributing resources and responsibilities across the community, settlements created resilience that no single family could achieve alone. Settlers from 3 counties gather in a circle, sharing body heat and stories to keep the darkness at bay. Children sleep in the center, surrounded by adults who take turns watching the fire. Outside, the storm rages on, but in here, humanity creates its own warmth. "We told stories all night," remembered Emma Johnson. Tales from the old country, jokes, songs, even ghost stories, though those seemed less popular with the wind howling outside. By dawn, strangers had become neighbors and neighbors had become family. Perhaps most importantly, frontier communities developed knowledge transfer systems that helped newcomers survive their first winters. The hardest lessons had been paid for in lives. Passing them on cost nothing but time and attention. Henderson organized what we called winter school every September, wrote Sarah Peterson. 4 evenings where experienced settlers taught newcomers everything they needed to know: how to bank a fire overnight, how to recognize frostbite before it became deadly, which wild plants could supplement dwindling food stores. Attendance wasn't optional. The whole settlement made sure every new family participated. This formalized education supplemented the informal advice that flowed constantly between veteran settlers and greenhorns. Those who had survived multiple winters watched for the telltale signs of inadequate preparation and intervened before tragedy struck. Williams noticed I hadn't insulated my north wall properly, recorded Michael Johnson in 1886. Rather than just telling me, he showed up with materials and helped me fix it, said nothing, just worked alongside me for a day. Later I learned he'd done the same for 3 other families that autumn. Communities even developed systems for maintaining mental health through the darkest months. Regular social gatherings combated isolation and depression. Settlements organized weekly events throughout winter. Dances, religious services, communal meals, or simple visiting rotations that ensured no family went too long without company. Mother established Sunday gatherings after the 79 winter when Pearson lost his mind from loneliness, wrote Emma Johnson. Each week, 3 or 4 families would squeeze into someone's home. Didn't matter if there was barely room to stand. Being pressed together was part of the comfort. We'd sing, pray, share what food we could, and remember we weren't facing winter alone. These gatherings weren't luxuries, they were mental health interventions that literally saved lives. Communities that maintained regular social contact through winter lost fewer members to the despair that could be as deadly as cold or hunger. Anderson would have ended things in 82 if not for the weekly gatherings, Peterson recorded carefully in his private journal. He told me so years later, said hearing children laugh every Sunday gave him reason to keep his fire burning through Saturday night. The Johnson settlement in Dakota Territory survived the notorious winter of 1871 by establishing weekly gatherings featuring music and storytelling. While 3 nearby homesteads lost settlers to suicide or exposure that season, the Johnson community endured intact, demonstrating how shared humanity often made the difference between life and death on the winter frontier. Spring's first green shoots push through the snow where many never lived to see them. A woman kneels, running her fingers over tender growth while tears track silently down her weathered face. She has survived another winter, but not everyone did. Some mornings I can't believe we made it, she whispers to no one. Some mornings I can't believe they didn't. As the frontier developed, these informal community practices gradually evolved into more structured institutions. Volunteer fire departments emerged from winter watch systems. Town councils grew from emergency committees. Churches expanded their role from spiritual guidance to social welfare. By the late 1800s, many frontier communities had developed comprehensive winter preparation procedures that addressed every aspect of survival, physical, psychological, and social. These systems weren't imposed from above, but emerged organically from hard-won experience. What strikes me most about these frontier winter communities, wrote historian Patricia Reynolds in 1903, is how democratic their survival systems were. Rich or poor, everyone contributed what they could and received what they needed. A banker might find himself shoveling snow alongside a day labourer. A doctor's wife might mend clothes for a farmer's children. Winter stripped away social pretensions and revealed the core truth that surviving required everyone. This egalitarian approach to winter survival reflected the frontier's harsh reality. Cold, hunger, and isolation threatened everyone, regardless of wealth or status. A blizzard didn't care if you were the town banker or a homesteader. Only by working together could communities ensure that everyone saw spring. Our winter association had one rule, recorded James Peterson. No one freezes, no one starves, no one faces the darkness alone. Everything else was negotiable. The legacy of these frontier winter communities extends far beyond their immediate survival. The mutual aid societies, cooperative practices, and communal support systems they developed became templates for rural American life well into the 20th century. Even as technology advanced, as coal stoves replaced buffalo chip fires, as railroads brought regular food supplies, as telephones connected isolated homesteads, the memory of those deadly winters remained. Communities continued to watch out for their vulnerable members, to share resources in hard times, to face challenges collectively rather than individually. "We've got electric lights and telephones now," wrote Emma Johnson in 1922. "But when a blizzard comes, we still check on our neighbours. Some lessons you don't unlearn, even when the need seems past." As our journey through frontier winter survival comes to a close, we're left with an appreciation not just of physical techniques and practical knowledge, but of the human connections that ultimately made the difference between life and death. Those settlers who survived the harshest environments weren't necessarily the strongest individuals, or even the best prepared. They were those who recognized their interdependence, who built communities strong enough to withstand whatever winter brought. Their legacy isn't just in the towns and farms they established, but in the understanding that true resilience comes from connection, that humans facing extreme challenges are stronger together than apart, that the community, not the individual, is the basic unit of survival. As you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, safe from the elements that once threatened your ancestors, consider how many of the comforts surrounding you exist because those frontier communities endured, how the knowledge they preserved, the systems they developed, the towns they built formed the foundation for your modern life. The distance between their experience and yours may seem vast, separated by technology, time, and comfort, but the fundamental lessons they learned about human survival remain as relevant today as they were on the frozen prairie. When we face our own challenges, different in form but similar in effect, we do well to remember how frontier communities survived their darkest winters, not through rugged individualism, but through cooperation, not through hoarding resources, but through sharing them, not by turning inward, but by reaching outward. In that sense, their story isn't just history, it's instruction. A reminder that whatever hardships we face them better together than alone. The fire burns low now in our frontier cabin. Outside, the snow continues to fall, but its threat seems lessened by the knowledge that neighbors are near, that help would come if needed, that no one faces winter's darkness completely alone. Inside your warm, comfortable room, far from the prairie blizzards and deadly cold, you can feel your own body growing heavier, drifting towards sleep. The lessons of the frontier settle gently around you like a blanket. Stories of struggle and survival, of community and connection, of finding light in the darkest season. As you breathe deeply and let go of wakefulness, remember that you too are part of an unbroken chain of human resilience, stretching from those frontier cabins to your present moment. And like those settlers finding peace in the knowledge that they weren't alone, you can rest easily, knowing that their hard-won wisdom hasn't been lost but lives on in the communities we continue to build. Sleep well, warm and safe as winter settles outside your window and history's lessons wrap around you like a protective embrace.